Welcome back pilots to another Jetworks video. In this build we'll be doing the versions of the Mirage that will be the Kfir that I'm building. So you can use the plans to make a few different versions of the Mirage. The first step is gluing bulkhead 1 and fitting the RX shelf. Here I've got the side panels there. Bulkhead number 1, I've got the belly panel. I've already pre-marked 6mm strips at both sides. Apply a small amount of glue, whatever glue it is you use. Offer that up to bulkhead 1 and the belly panel, and then put that on and let the glue set in place. The lower corner reinforcers, I've got some 6mm strips cut there. Again, small amount of glue on one side of a strip, offer up the other side and give it a wee smudge about so it's a very thin application of contact adhesive. Now I'm using Yoo-Hoo Pod here. You can use whatever glue it is you prefer to use. So once we've got the first corner reinforcer down, we'll put the second one in. Again, small amount of glue along one surface. Smudge about so it just smoothens out the glue and makes sure it's a very thin application, and just piece by piece just slowly moving along the belly panel, making sure the outside is as flat and flush as possible, ready to accept the side panels. So we can see that we've got the 4 corner reinforcers in place, and then we're just getting the forward fuselage sides in place as well. So I'm just slowly forming it over the edge of the table just to get that nice smooth curve to try and match as close to the receiver shelf as possible. And on the feathered tail piece, a small amount of glue on both surfaces and just rub it about. So again, nice thin application, and we're letting the air get to it as it's contact adhesive, and it should stick pretty good and quick. So once we've got the receiver shelf glued up, offer it up into place, and as you can see, I've pinched the tail together, and we're just using a small piece of masking tape just to hold it in place while we move along onto the next steps. Trimming up the wee bits of excess foam that we've got at the back just to make sure it's nice and flush. And again, as always, I will apologise, pilots, builders, because use the build guide. The build guide's there for a reason. Craig spends a bit of time to offer these up for us. These build videos are just for visual reasons, and to help you move along to see how they actually get put together, other than using the construction guide. So along the lower corner reinforcers, I've offered up some Yoo-Hoo Pod, smudged away any of the excess glue that was there, put it into place and just lined it up nice and tight against bulkhead number 1, so we've got a nice flush finish, and just pushing it against the bulk table to make sure it's nice and flat. Next step's the cockpit side reinforcers, or support panel, sorry, bridge panels and the magnet panel. So again, small amount of glue on one side, offer up the opposite, and then smudge it about so it's a very thin application. Now this one we're doing the twin cockpit build. Sorry, this build we're doing the twin cockpit, but as you will see later on, we end up with a single seater cockpit. So the next step is the EDF version here that I'm building. I've cut the slot in the wing plate ready to accept the 6mm carbon rod that I'm using, but it's a tube actually. The tube seems to be a bit more stronger than just using a straight rod. So where we've taped up the presentation side, which will be the top side, so it's nice and flat, and make sure that we're not letting any of the glue get through into the build table. We're taping up the underside as well to help keep it nice and clean finish, and when we remove the tape, we'll be removing any of the excess epoxy that's there. So I've mixed up about 12 grams of epoxy and harden it, and I've used some micro balloons as well to thicken it up and make it go that wee bit further, so we're using as less glue as possible. The key part here is teasing out the glue to the sides of the Depron just to make sure that you know, we're not just putting glue in the bottom and putting in your support spar. I've got a couple of batteries there on the wing plate, keeping it nice and flush to the table, as flat as possible. And then with any excess epoxy, we just applying that to the top of the carbon spar that we've got in place. Like I say, you could use, you know, wood, whatever it is you have, and happy to use as your, you know, your support rods. So while we remove the tape, we're removing excess epoxy that's there and leave you with a nice clean finish. A couple of extra batteries on the bottom, and then we just allow the glue to set. Now that was 30-minute epoxy we used there. We'll also be using 5-minute epoxy throughout the build as well. So once that's all set and nice and cured, just remove the tape from the presentation side, and then separating the spare pieces of foam that I've already pre-slotted and cut for the servos and the bulkheads. Now this part I'd already marked on the plans. This is for your intake moving into, so that there's a nice bit of airflow goes along from the receiver and into the EDF intake itself. So next step, we've marked the belly, sorry not the belly, the wing plate with where the side panels, the lower panels should go. And I've got a wee bit masking tape there just to make sure I don't make a mess of the wing and keep the glue in there nice and neat and tidy. We're also using the jigs for the bottom, just to make sure that the side panels are at the correct angle needed to, you know, A, for the fuselage to give it the shape, but also to help, you know, make sure your EDF bulkheads are lined up in the right position, your tail and the intake parts as well. So they've already been pre-trimmed, and what we've done is we've taken it, slid it onto the wing where the glue is, and lining it up from the rear, making sure the rear's nice and tight up until the front of the wing plate. Again, using the formers just to mark it off and make sure it's at the right angle. I've got a couple of modelling pins in there just to hold it in place. So the next step's getting ready for the belly panel, and before we're doing that, we're going to put in our servos. And I thought it'd be nice and fancy here and cut it at an angle and flip it out and just tease the servo in. Didn't quite work like that. There's no reason to be fancy. Just take your time, make sure that you're where you've cut ready to mark for your servos. Make sure it's big enough and you can get your servos in there nice and easily. I've got them in, glued them in. The excess pieces of foam that we've cut, we've glued that back in place as well. So next step is the EDF bulkheads, the forward and the rear. They're two different sizes. I've already taken the opportunity just to trim them a bit and make sure that they fit. I'm using the Freewing 70mm fan unit here. Small amount of glue around the EDF casing, and then offer up the forward bulkhead, and then the same with the rear. Fit went together pretty well. However, I was left a wee bit of gap, on not so much a gap, because the EDF unit itself was slightly shorter. I thought I'd measured it and it was fine, slightly shorter, but we'll come to fixing that in just a minute. So once you've got everything in, just slide it into the wing plate itself, and it should line up again with the side panels, providing you use the jigs. And I'm just using a couple of modelling pins just to tack it into place. There is some level marks on the bottom of the EDF bulkhead that should sit level with the wing plate itself. Just make sure you're happy with it, direction, and make sure it's nice and, you know, straight, and allow that to set. So the next step is, you know, making sure you've got a nice generous hole for your EDF to allow the airflow coming through. Getting your side panels on, the lower corner reinforcers onto the corner side panels, which slot in nice and tight. does take a wee bit, it did take a wee bit of trimming. What I'd done was I just cut some relief from where the servos are. This shouldn't be needed if you do it properly, because obviously I didn't get my servos flush against the wing plate. So I cut a wee relief in the lower corner reinforcer. So a small amount of Yoo-hoo pour on one side and smudge it about like I've been doing, so you get a very, very thin application, and offer it up to the side panel. And just take your time, make sure it's nice and, you know, level all the way along it. And once that's in and stuck, move on to the number 3 and 4 corner reinforcers. Again, a small amount of glue, just a thin bead of glue along one side. Offer them up together and just smudge it about so you get a thin application of glue on both sides. And I put a wee bit of glue in between the bulkhead there and the corner reinforcer so that there's a wee bit of adhesion there. And this all did fit pretty well. So once you're happy with that, I'm using I think it was a 60 amp ESC that I've got here. So there is markings on the templates for placing your ESC. What I would suggest is, you know, get your ESC, go along with the build, mark it up, and then cut out what you need for the ESC, so you're not actually cutting out too much foam or not enough. As you can see there, I'm just trimming it just small pieces, small bits at a time, just to try and get as nice and tight as fit as possible, keeping the cooling side of the ESC nice and flat and flush against the wing plate, just to help make sure there's a nice clean airflow going into the EDF unit itself, and obviously allowing the ESC to cool also. A small amount of hot glue on the bottom, just again to secure it in place. Now test your electrics when you're getting close to sealing things up with, obviously the next step is the belly panel. Make sure you test your electrics. I thought I had everything all nice and good, and I thought, yeah, let's just check it before we seal it up. So fitting up the battery, making sure the radio's fine, testing the orientation, and obviously we were sucking it was actually a Hoover that I'd built and not a jet. Changed to the wires, that switched the orientation of the EDF and actually made it go in the right direction. So like I was saying earlier, there was a wee bit of a gap that I could see there, so I just got an extra scrap piece of foam and just glued it in against the bulkhead and the unit itself to make sure it was nice and tight. I've cut a wee relief in the forward bulkhead just to accept the motor wires going through. Hot glued it down and tuck into place. Next step is fitting the belly panel, whether that be a pusher or an EDF. Obviously I've chosen the EDF version, and there's a couple of cheater holes just in the bottom just to help get some airflow going into the AC, but these cheater holes are primarily to help cooling the ESC as well. Be mindful that the intakes on the Mirage, or certainly the Kfir that we're building here, are quite short and quite tight, so you want to get as much nice smooth airflow in as possible. And if that means cheater holes, as much as we don't like it, then so be it. You'd rather have your ESC and your motor performing well. So a small amount of glue along the contact surfaces of the bottom belly panel, and I've offered up both just to make sure there's glue on both sides of both the belly panel and the lower corner reinforcers. I've put a wee bit of hot glue on the EDF bulkheads just to help stick it in the middle, as there is a slight curve to the belly itself, and a couple of modelling pins at the back as well, just to again tack it into place. And then I've got some going along the fuselage as well, the belly. Make sure if you're using modelling pins, you put them in at an angle, not just straight up and down, or they tend not to do the purpose that you're needing. So in terms of hinges here, I'm using TPU hinges that I've printed, a flexible plastic. However, you know, you can use material ones, you can use some card, some plastic credit cards. I've heard the other things being used in the past, or there's CA hinges you can use, or you can actually use what's in the plans. The plans comes along with a 3M ply guide for cutting the elevator horns here, or you can use the hinges that Craig kindly has designed on the Jetworks website as well. Fantastic hinges. However, my printer was busy at the time, so I had some TPU hinges lying about, so we're just using them. So mixing up a wee bit of epoxy here. I've taped off the Elevon, a wee bit of 5-minute epoxy just on the sides of the control horns itself. Offer it up to the Elevons and just scrape away any of the excess glue. So next step is putting both of them together and the next corner reinforcers. So these are for the sides. They'll glue onto the bottom panels, and there's a big angle that's cut along there. I've not really shown it pretty well. If you just follow the guides, the plans, as you'll see in the plans, there's cut marks and lines for getting this part done, and it should fit in there nice and tight against the lower panels and the bulkhead itself. Offer it up to the panel and just let that set in place. So the next step is the exhaust bulkhead. So here I'm fortunate enough to have the use of a printer, and I've cut together a thrust tube for the 70mm. Obviously this is Kfir that we're building. You can use, apologies, I do a lot of the 3D printing, which I think is fantastic. However, these jets don't need to have 3D printed parts at all. It can all be done with foam. As you can see here, the thrust tube, that can be done with clear plastic. I've even seen Pringle tubes being used. However, like I say, these jets can all be done with just straight Depron or foam, whatever it is you can get your hand on. But the 3D parts are fantastic. So here we've got a small amount of glue on the exhaust bulkhead. Wiping away any of the excess. I've just slid it into place, and I'm using a wee bit of masking tape on the thrust tube on the side panels just to pull it together and make sure it's nice and tight just where we're letting the glue set. Fantastic. So control surfaces, going back to the Elevon's pilots, we have set in our hinges, and we've marked on the wing plate where our hinges are going to go. So carefully using a sharp knife, just cut along. I've measured it. I actually used about a 3mm piece of Depron that I had. I'd lined it up against the build table and the wing plate and just marked a straight line across it. Using some Yoo-hoo pour, it's just a small amount on the hinges itself. Give it a wee smudge about so there's not too much. Like I say, it's a very, very small amount you're needing. Scrap piece of foam, just wiping away any of the excess that we have there, and then carefully sliding it into position. Give it a wee wiggle about just to make sure there's a wee bit of free movement, it's not binding anywhere. And that's it, ready to move on to fitting the forward fuselage against the wing plate. So moving it into the wing plate, just test fitting it there. I've got all the wires from the EDF, the AC and the 2 rear servos on the contact surfaces. There's a small amount of glue on both sides. You'll see on the rear there I have actually cut a relief, which again is marked off in the plans. This is to allow the wires from the motors and the servos to go into the forward fuselage and keep it as nice and clean as possible. As you can see, the wires will sit below the wing plate itself. Again, nice design by Craig. It keeps the airflow nice and clean as possible moving into the EDF mouth itself. So the next step should be using the jigs. I'm taking the opportunity here to put on the nose cone that I've printed, lightweight PLA, just 2 walls, 0% infill, and what I'm doing here will get the nose cone aligner in place. I broke that, funnily enough, so we'll just cut out another one using that wee template that we have, and then what we'll do is we'll get the nose cone attached to it, get that stuck nice and tight in place, so that before we get to sanding it, I can move from the fuselage straight to the tail and get it all done in one place, and then that way the nose cone will help get a nice shape lined up. So now that the nose cone's on, it's time to get on to the fuselage, lower fuselage top. So on the contact surfaces there, we're just going to tuck in the receiver. And on the rear of the forward fuselage, a wee bit of glue there. Just smudge it about, make sure there's, both contacts. Always do it this way, and then I can see both surfaces have glue on it. I'm just putting a wee bit of hot glue on top of the bulkheads just to hold it into place, make sure it doesn't slide off, so that it's aligned nice and straight where I want it to be. And once that's set at the back, we're all pretty good. So in terms of building the Kfir, absolutely love this, is gorgeous. There's another part in the plans that comes along for the next top panel. As you can see there, there's an additional wee tailpiece on it that later on in the build actually broke off it. The tail itself has also been adjusted from the Mirage to suit the Kfir. Like I was saying at the beginning, there's a couple of different versions that's held in the Mirage III plans. So it's a bit of a bonus, a bumper pack that you get, deciding which one it is you want to build. So back to this, a wee small amount of glue on the underside, smudge it about, and then, put it in place and let the contact adhesive do its job. So I have already trimmed away the side, just cut it at an angle. And I've cut into the side panels. Again, on the plans, there's a wee marking there for cutting out your slot to house the canards at the front. So on the contact surfaces, the bulkheads, the rear exhaust, a small amount of glue on them as well, and then offer up the side panel. I actually trimmed a wee bit too much off at the front. You can see it's kind of twisted out there, but it's nothing to worry about, nothing that scratch building doesn't resolve. So all I've done is glued the bottom part. Wasn't wanting to put any stress on both parts and have it popping off, so I glued the bottom part first to make sure it was nice and stuck. As you can see, I've got some modelling pins going along it just to make sure it's held in place. And then once we've done that, we're going to move on to, once it's glued and it's set and I'm happy with it, you can see it's actually quite tight, we're moving on to gluing the top part itself. So I've squeezed a wee bit in at the exhaust bulkhead, and then a wee bit just moving along the top of the fuselage itself, in between the side panel and the top the top fuselage covers. Again, just smudging it about, pressing it together, make sure there's a good contact, that there's glue in both surfaces. That's the most important part. And then again, I'm just going to tack into place with some modelling pins. What I've got here, so I've done both parts. I actually got a wee bit of masking tape just to again hold it in place. Then I've got a wee rod, doweling tube with some sandpaper glued on it, and I'm just sanding the inside where the lower corner reinforcers are, just to remove as much as possible, get a nice smooth transition into the fuselage itself. So after we had done that and we allowed the glue to cure on the side panels, got a nice sharp blade and started trimming it off, cutting away as much of the foam before I get to sanding. There's no point in sanding your life away. Cut as much of it off as possible, get as close to the shape as you want, and then just carefully with a sharp blade, as I say, carefully with sharp blades, start carving things away. So we've been out, we've got it sanded, and unfortunately for whatever reason I didn't include gluing the intakes on, but you know, just a bit of epoxy and we glued them into place. So here we're on to the turtle deck. Now this turtle deck is cut for this double-seater version, and I've just got it in the tabs in place on the fuselage itself, and then using the inner supports, gluing them on in place, making sure it's nice and flat. And I didn't glue it, I didn't fix it to the fuselage and glue it onto the fuselage. I chose to do it this way so that once it's actually built and set, I can shape this and sand it more comfortably than actually having it on the model and end up hacking into it with edges of sandpaper and stuff. So I've glued the side panels all together, the supports, offer it up to the fuselage where the locating tabs are, and then put some glue on the top ready to accept the top of the turtle deck itself. And again, just making sure it's lined up, it's nice and level, and I'm quite happy with how it is. Nice and flat and flush together, like you can see. So you know it's built straight. There's the end piece as well. Now that that's glued together, we're going to get the end piece on. Again, line it up on top of the fuselage. And I'm just using a couple of modelling pins to tack it into place. I'm not really worried about holes in the fuselage because obviously this is going to glue over the top of it. And then I'm just trimming a wee bit just to make sure, again, it's nice and flush with the fuselage itself. Small amount of glue and smudge it about. Give it a chance to air dry. And then I'm just putting a wee bit of masking tape on there just to make sure that no excess glue goes onto the fuselage and it sticks. So we should be moving on to the intakes. As you can see, we've already done the intakes. We've used the wee dowel with the sanding paper and we've sanded it off as nice and smooth as possible as we can in there. We've got that all set up, ready to go. So now that I've got the turtle deck done, so initially was to do twin cockpit here. This part, this is the twin cockpit cutout. I've cut the teeth off it, which should sit into the slots there. However, not realising it, I had a twin canopy, which was a Mirage. I thought that would have fitted, but doesn't look quite right. So I'm going to use a single canopy that I have, and rather than have it sit here where it should, single canopy slots in there. I didn't have the cutout here. As you can see, this part is for the twin canopy. Didn't have the single canopy cutout, so that should actually sit there. So with a wee bit of modifying and head scratching, decided that yep, that's what we're going to do. I've just offered up the single canopy, marked that in a place where it's going to finish, and then using a scrap piece of foam, marking up an additional piece to go in there where we should actually have this single canopy magnet tray. So we've got a wee scrap piece, cut it out and it looks nice and tight, and we'll offer that up and glued it into place. Rather than making a new turtle deck, chose to use the same one that we had built and prepared ready for the twin canopy, and we're just using that on and sliding it up into position where obviously it's located at the single canopy spot, and it actually looks pretty good. I did have a look at a lot of Kfir pictures for reference to see, you know, from the canopy to the tail, and it's all nice and flat. So yeah, I'm happy with it, but that's scratch building. So getting back to the obviously canopy, we've got that, the intakes. Now that we've got that in place, it's the wee forward piece. So again, we've 3D printed just a blank of the canopy, just so I can get the right shape and spacings. Small amount of UHU porn, offer it up, make sure it's nice and sticky, and then we just leave that to set and cure. On to the filler. Filler seems to be a bit hot topic discussion these days. I've made the canards. I've got a wee bit of balsa leading and trailing edge. Here I'm actually using poly filler, watered it down ever so slightly, using Craig's techniques. I think it was the F22 build, just to fill any pores that we have, and I've managed to slow it down quick enough to just slightly show, yeah, it was smooth and filler paste that I've used. Obviously it's not as lightweight as, you know, your standard model building stuff, but it works pretty well. Possibly, yeah, it will add a wee bit of weight, but if I can reduce the pain in my sanding, then I'm happy to add a little bit of weight. It's not an issue. And then where I've sanded it off on the turtle deck, again just using some of the smoothing filler to close off the pores. So onto the canards now. Like I said, I had some balsa leading and trailing edge on it just to firm it up, make sure it's nice and stiff. Got a wee bit of epoxy there. This is just 5-minute epoxy that I'm using. Mix up, not a lot at all was needed. I've actually used more than mixed up more than I needed. And using a scrap piece of foam on the fuselage where it's cut out itself, just putting them, applying the glue in there, so that trying to keep it as nice and clean as possible. When I slide these canards in, any extra glue is going to go into the inside. So slide them into position where you think it looks good, and I've just measured that up just to make sure that both are in the same sort of distance, and in height wise, again, that one's matching the other one as well, and they were pretty level. I was really surprised, but I was pretty happy with it. So there's a wee look, and that's as level as I can get them just by eyeballing it, and I think, you know, I agree, it looks pretty damn awesome. Obviously there's a wee bit of filler on the nose there, just in front of the canopy. It still needs done, but yeah, it looks pretty good. So moving on to the vertical stabilizer and the wee parachute pods, I believe they are. Now the vertical stabilizer's no actually fitted into place yet. What I've done is I've sanded off the wee chute pods, offering them up to the vertical stabilizer when it's in place, just so that I can, you know, get a good feel for how it is. Make sure it looks nice and level and flush against the fuselage, so that when it comes to gluing, there's a wee bit extra surface area that will help, you know, with a wee bit of epoxy and get it stuck in there pretty good. Now also on the tail there, you can see I've cut a wee, I don't know, it looks like a skirt now that I look at it. It's a bit triangulish, needs a bit of shaping. Obviously the Kfir's got a different exhaust, which is also available again, which I had purchased and printed and not realising it in the heat of the moment and built, and I actually just got a piece of foam and made a wee skirt for the exhaust. So in this part of the build, what I've done is flipped it upside down, and I'm using some bits of fiberglass cloth that I've got, measuring out from the estimated CG. You can see it's marked there, there's a wee X marks the spot, and I've got some hot glue, and I've measured it from about a third from the CG up to the hook, which should leave about 2/3 from the hook to the nose. And as I say, should, estimated. These are just rough. It, you know, works for me. It's round about in the 1/3 area, and it works pretty well from the bungee. So just underneath, or sorry, in front of the bungee hook, on the underside of the nose, because it's a belly lander, you know, it's going to get scuffed up a bit. I've got very lightweight fiberglass cloth, and I've got some water-based varnish there that I'm just putting on just to give it a wee bit of protection. Where the intakes are, you can see there's a slight gap in between the intakes and the fuselage itself. Happy with that. However, I'm just putting a wee bit of fiberglass cloth there, A, to support it, to save it getting chunked up by hitting sticks or planting into the next tree, but also to stop it, collecting grass and cutting and clogging up the front. So canopy and the magnets and stuff, I don't think I actually included the magnet part. However, we do have a wee bit of the canopy build here. So I've cut a scrap piece of foam for a canopy base. Now this piece of foam, it lines up directly inside the cockpit place itself. And then I've got a wee base also cut from the bottom of the 3D printed cockpit so that I know what size it is I need. This way I don't need to put a tongue on it. That'll just slide in there, the canopy base on top of it, and it'll glue it into, it'll secure it in place. It won't slide about. And then I'll put a wee magnet at the front and on the rear part there as well, the turtle deck. So now that I've got that on there, I've trimmed back the printed canopy from Craig. It's absolutely fantastic. Once I started doing clear canopies, I'm sorry, but there's been no going back. Yes, you can print plugs and make your own. Craig supplies the plug files for 3D printing and pulling your own canopies, whether it be out of plastic sheets and a canopy, a vac former machine, or just using empty bottles, clear bottles, and forming them that way. I've done that before. Anyhow, back to the canopy. So once I've got the canopy base in place, I'll put a wee bit at the back and trim up how much foam I'm going to need for the rear of the canopy just to support it, and have a magnet there as well. I've got some masking tape in there just to make sure any glue that I use while making the canopy doesn't get stuck to the jet itself before we're actually finished. So using a wee bit of hot glue, just securing that in place just to make sure it's nice and tight. Use a scrap piece of foam to scrape away any of the excess glue and remove it. As you can see, there was a wee bit of glue stuck to the masking tape there, and then just using a pen against the turtle deck for where I've shaped it away, just to give me a rough guide and a marking, and I'll just carefully trim away with a sharp blade. Be careful where your fingers are, where your hands are, and just nice and slowly, don't go hacking at it. And then just trim it off small bit by small bit by small bit till you get the shape that you're looking for. Keep it as nice and tight as possible to the canopy, the clear canopy itself. So once I was happy with that, I'm just marking up where it is that I expect to put the seat and the crazy pilot and the wee dashboard that I've printed. I think that was actually off my Harrier that exploded, but we'll not go there. So just marking up where that's going to go. And again, this is definitely not scale. So you scale pilots out there saying that's not a Kfir canopy. Well, it's my Kfir canopy. It's fun, and it should be, because that's what scratch building's all about. You make the model, you build the model, you do it how you choose, as long as you build it and you have fun. So here we are cutting out the seat. So we're just digging into it just to recess the pilot a bit. He needs a bit more trimming. He's been printed in lightweight PLA. I think it was 2 walls. As you can see, 0% infill. Obviously just keeping things as light as possible. And constantly trimming as you go along. Here we're just trimming back the cockpit display. HUD, whatever the technical term is for it. And as we see, again, that was just a file that I have. Cutting into it just to recess it so the seat can drop down a bit. Intention is to get a couple of ejection hooks on it, because this wee pilot's going to need it as well. And just cutting off a couple of bits of foam just to build, a wee bit of interest at the back. I don't know what that is at the back of a Kfir cockpit seat. I don't know if it even should be there, but it is in my jet. So once we've got that, all I'm doing here is just cutting up wee scrap pieces of foam just to make the wee part at the front of the display. I'm sure, well, I hope someone can come back to me with the clever names of what these parts are actually called. I know a few budding pilots that are part of the group will certainly most likely be shouting at the video just now saying, Baz, what you all about? So again, just wee bits of foam, just trimming it up, getting it to form some sort of canopy. Yes, probably up close you'll be looking thinking that's not how it should look. However, when it's zipping past you in the air, you're not going to notice. So there you can see we've painted it. I've got his wee ejection hooks glued in above his seat because he's going to need it. I've taped off round about the cockpit area with some masking tape, putting some wee strips of masking tape from the underside as well, just making sure it all fits nicely, and then we'll get some Yoo-hoo or whatever glue it is you choose to use just around the canopy. Now we're certainly giving it more airtime than we normally give anything. Offer up the clear canopy and squeeze it in, make sure it's nice and tight, you've got the fit that you're looking for, and then carefully pull over the masking tape just to hold it tight against the canopy and clean away any excess glue that's there. Not sure what this wee red stripe is. Anyway, however, we're now on to finishing up really. We've got the vertical stabiliser there. We did a wee bit of work on it earlier, with the chute pods and things. So I've got a wee bit of Yoo-hoo pour up the front end of the vertical stabiliser. I'll be happy that it's glued in with that, and I'm mixing up some 5-minute epoxy for the back. Apologies that it's not actually very visible here, as I'm kinda off camera with it just now, but you get the idea. Get some epoxy on the contact surfaces in the wee locating tabs, offer it up to the fuselage, and what I'm doing here is I'm pressing it into the fuselage, pushing it into place, so that if there's any excess glue there we can just wipe it away. 5-minute epoxy, hold it till it sets it off, and it looks fantastic. It's finished up pretty well. Yeah, I mean the batteries, I used the batteries to hold the wing plate level so that I could eyeball the vertical stabiliser, make sure it's nice and straight, it's finished off great. Apologies we didn't include the exhausts, but here we are, the build's finished, absolutely stunning jet. I hope this has helped you pilots on your way along building it. We already have some fantastic Mirages and Kfirs, but like I say, apologies for not following the build guide, but that's just me and how I tend to build things. But I hope this has helped pilots. Looking forward to seeing your builds and obviously your maidens and paint jobs. Thanks again, pilots.